Sure, I hit the button. There it is. It's recording now.
Sometimes it takes a second, yeah.
Awesome. Well, welcome everyone to the Brisbane Azure User Group. We've still got a few people coming through, but we're going to get on the road and start doing the presentation. So June 2021, Brisbane Azure User Group. First of all, big thank you out to our sponsors. Our sponsors have been amazing and they've been there for a very long time. So Codify and Microsoft, you've done an awesome job and thank you very much. Before we get into some of the news, we've got a few things lined up for this year, but there's lots and lots of opportunities for anyone who wants to jump in and give a presentation. Flick us an email. So these will be on the slides, or you can get in contact with us via the meetup group, or the email address down the bottom of the screen, baug@outlook.com.au. So yeah, if you want to get involved, it's a great opportunity and we've only got limited spaces. Also, if you have a short talk, December is normally the time where we do lightning talks. So that's another great opportunity for people to get involved and dip your toes in the water of what this is like.
You can also accommodate a short talk anytime too. We don't, if you really want. Yeah.
we're pretty agile. So, but I'm going to hand it over to Dan. He's going to talk about some job opportunities that are coming through. Dan?
Sorry, unmute. Yeah, absolutely. So we're looking to expand our team at Deloitte. So we have potentially a lot of opportunities coming up. And if you're looking for a new role and you're really enthusiastic and skilled in any of the things listed on this slide, then we'd certainly like to hear from you. So you can scan that QR code if you want to connect with Beck McDonald, who's our recruitment guru. Or you can ping me if you want, and happy to refer you.
Cool. Awesome. So some quick updates. For those of you that find ARM templates incredibly difficult, they're not that bad. But anyway, we've got a new DSL for ARM templates. It definitely makes it simpler. So Bicep has come along, and we've got a whole bunch of things that you'd expect from DSLs, like syntax and all that good stuff. Plugins available for VS Code. It's pretty cool, and it'll compile it into its intermediary code, which is an ARM template, and then you'll be able to run those ARM templates after you go through Bicep. Static web apps. Microsoft have delivered an absolute clanger here. It's fantastic. They kind of missed on the WAF at the front and the data bit, but everything else in between is pretty awesome and packaged up. So it's functions as well as your static website for an incredibly low price. Pretty cool and definitely worth checking out. So especially if you're doing SPA style application development, this is a great idea. These ones here I was talking before, don't rush out and try and mine your crypto on these. They're not quite priced at that, but if you do have the need for an awesome set of 30 series video cards, I believe it's 8 on this machine, as well as a little bit of RAM, this is a pretty monster machine. So it's pretty awesome. These have just come out, so you can check it out now. I think it's like 3 times faster than the last iteration. It's pretty cool. So Dataverse, so for all of you people who are up using Dynamics 365 and you want to get those insights using Synapse Analytics, this Synapse link for Dataverse allows you to synchronize your OLTP. I'm not going to say that. I always get that wrong. But it syncs your real-time processing data into your analytical data in near real time, and it's continuously exported. So you don't have to worry about those ELT processes. You can just click a single button and away it goes. Very similar to the Cosmos one that came out not so long ago. Speaking of Cosmos, there's a dedicated gateway, so it allows you to cache a lot of your data up there in that gateway and reduce your costs. And that's great if you've got like a heavy load on your Cosmos database. They can get pricey under a high load. This is a way that you can reduce your costs. There's also some other things coming out as well. So you've got your always encrypted like SQL that's coming out for Cosmos. And then a few other things, which is, what have we got? Role-based access control for Cosmos, which is coming out as well, and serverless for all the APIs, not just the other one, not just SQL. Speaking of SQL, we've got, it's kind of the blockchain is now being embedded inside SQL Server, which is great to hear that, no, it's got nothing to do with crypto. Sorry. What it is, it's all about proof of transactions that are occurring, and they're getting written to a blockchain, and that blockchain can be held outside. And that way you can have multiple people verifying the integrity of the database. It's pretty cool. It's just like an extended trust type scenario that will give you better assurance around the data and who's changed the data. Azure Arc. Now, Arc is taking off. It's fantastic, and I can't wait to see Todd's presentation. So I gave you a sneak preview before. Todd is coming up with a presentation in a couple of months around Azure Arc. So I hope I'm not winding him up too much, but we're certainly waiting for that one. But the app services preview just launched on Azure Arc. So I haven't seen it in their accelerator Arc box yet, but I'm sure it's going to come to that pretty soon. This allows you to spin up app services, functions, logic apps, event grid, API management. Now, there's already the data services on Arc, and there's already the Kubernetes, which has gone GA. I think I might have just, oh yeah, that slide there. So it's getting pretty cool, Azure Arc. So it allows you to extend that Azure, you know, the familiar control plane of Azure, where you can create your own custom region with Azure Arc, and that region can be as small as a couple of Raspberry Pis. Yeah, people have extended Azure, the portal.azure onto your Raspberry Pis with Azure Arc, which is pretty crazy. And run websites on it. It's nuts. So Elastic, they're coming to Azure. So there's a SaaS offering now for if you're using Kibana, Elasticsearch, Logstash, any of those sort of things. You can now have that without the pain of the configuration. That's all done for you. It really makes it a very simple offering for you to spin up and get going. It's a whole bunch of compliance around Azure. So I think it's the most compliant cloud. That doesn't sound right, but anyway. So there's lots and lots of compliance certifications on Azure. The 100th one just came out. If you're in Australia, which most of you will be, and you're looking around compliance, there's a link here to the Irap certification. That's a great one because that's their certification for Azure to run Australian government protected level security services. Now, protected is pretty serious. It's far above like financial certifications. So if you have the need to run protected level services, you can check out the Irap assessment on Azure. Yeah, so who knew? GPT-3, it's coming for all of us. You can now type in and get it to code for you inside Power Apps. I've got nothing to say on this. As a programmer, I'm not sure how I feel about this. It's pretty cool, but I'm not sure how I feel. That's all I can say. And finally, I love space, so I've got to plug this in. So recently they did a piece of work with Azure to connect the satellite data into one of these mobile Azure data centers that you can see over there on the left. It's obvious, it's clearly on a runway. So they've been able to increase the time to actionable intelligence to a factor of 5 through the way that Azure Orbital's connecting all this stuff through. It's pretty cool if you want to check out Azure Orbital. It's all of the space satellite Azure parts. It's pretty cool. A few events coming up. We've got Integration Down Under, 17th of June. So it's pretty cool. Check it out. And a couple of resources. So I put this here if anyone's looking for some resources around Azure. We've got Slack, we've got YouTube. There's a bunch of training things here. And most importantly, really cool blogs. So the Scots are great. The Azure blog is awesome. It lets you know what's going on. IT Ops is there too. All right, so
before we jump into just thought I'd point out Barry's pointed out that tomorrow there's a lightning talk on Bicep that's happening at the Brisbane Full Stack User Group, and he's put the link in there if you want to register for that.
Fantastic. So that's at SSW if you want to come along, sign up. It's pretty cool. They've got 3 talks, I believe, tomorrow. Bicep's one of them. JK's doing another one. Yeah, looks pretty cool. All right, now I'm going to introduce Michael Smith. So Michael is here. He's going to do a great talk about Azure AD and Identity. So welcome, Michael, and it's going to be fun. I can't wait to hear what you've got to say.
All right, actually going to stand up. Got a standing desk here, so actually transition to standing up for the talk, make it a bit more official. Let me just sort out the slide presentation. Thank you, Damien, for the introduction. All right, and I'm also going to try to use Teams native PowerPoint presentation ability instead of just sharing the screen. So we'll see how that goes. So yes, hi everyone. Thanks for spending some of your Tuesday evening with me. Well, Tuesday for those in Australia. So yes, my name is Michael Smith. I'm the identity practice lead at MOQ Digital in our sort of cybersecurity arm. Began in IT 2006. I joined MOQ 2017, and I've been doing identity-focused stuff for quite a few years now. On the personal note, I'm a New Zealander, but grew up in Singapore actually. Moved to Sydney in 2016. I've got 3 nephews. The one at the top there, I was born during COVID back in Auckland and just got to meet it the other month. I was able to go back to the bubble and in my spare time do tennis and Toastmasters. So a little bit about me. So today, last time we had Rory talk about identity, and he covered a whole raft of different identity features within Azure, but he didn't have time to cover them all. And so I thought I would cover a few more of the bases to do with identity and Azure. So I wanted to kick off, and this is what I'm going to talk through, talking about why I think identity is so important as a consideration. And then sort of in terms of the meat, I want to talk about how we choose to do cloud authentication within the context of hybrid organizations where there's some in the cloud and some on-prem. And then I want to move into the governance space and talk a little bit about privileged identity management, what that means, what we can do with that. And then lastly, just touch a little bit on identity protection. And if we get up there in terms of licensing, what sort of features are available to us from a protection standpoint. In terms of questions, I'm happy for them to come through. I've tried to set up my screen such that I can see questions as they come in. But if I don't notice, feel free to either come off mute or Damien or Daniel can just let me know, and we'll deal with them, and from there. So why identity? So I guess hopefully most of us know what identity is. We're talking about verifying who someone is and what level of access they have in a particular system. Basically, the positive side is making sure that people have the right access to what they need to do. But for IT pros in particular, identity often comes as an afterthought because we're focused on delivering, say a website for a customer, or we're focused on building servers that support a particular application, or developing an entire application within Azure. And often the last thing that we think about is how are we going to make sure people are who they say they are, and what level of access both to use a system and also to administer, to be able to change a system. Last year, I did a course on cybersecurity, and particularly around the role of a CISO. And in one of the books by one of the lecturers, he talks about the 5 reasons why cybersecurity initiatives fail. And one of them is forgetting to bake cybersecurity into digital transformation. And I think it's just so important because identity is so foundational that we consider that whatever we're doing, whether it's in the cloud or on-prem. Another reason we should care about identity is also because the vast majority of breaches have an identity breach at some point. It's incredibly rare that at some point an attacker or an internal actor that is disgruntled, or perhaps just an internal actor that makes a mistake, isn't using an identity or getting a hold of credentials to be able to do something. They usually need to have access to someone else's account to be able to do something. An example was, I think it was last year, Service New South Wales didn't turn on MFA. There was a phishing attack, and people were able to get in and just go through. It was enough just for them to go through inboxes. There was enough information there to have a huge breach on their hands. And lastly, why we should care about identity is that identity is the new perimeter. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the future slides. So another term that's often bandied about in terms of identity is zero trust. We used to, within IT, we've got a lot of things happening, whether it's on-prem or within the cloud. And we know that we've got a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of attack vectors. And we used to try to control that by having a trusted network strategy. So we would just, for on-prem, we would just try to have a network. And often when I talk to companies that are moving into the cloud, they just try to replicate that in the cloud. They just try to have a secure area, might have an express route, and just have people VPNing in. And you care far less about the verification and the access once people are in. You're mostly focused on that network and trusted perimeter sort of aspect. Sorry, getting a little warm here. But increasingly, we're seeing that move outside that trusted perimeter, and we're also seeing a shift from attackers to trying to penetrate a network to get in, to trying to, as I was saying earlier, to grab identities to get in. It didn't hold up. So this new sort of more comprehensive strategy, the zero trust, enabling people to be outside the network and caring more about who someone is rather than whether or not they are already on the network. So that zero trust, linking that back into the identity conversation. I did want to take a moment. I found this really cool slide when I was looking through the Microsoft security architecture, because it's very easy when we talk about identity to think just about user access and productivity. And from that standpoint, it's blindingly obvious. You want to focus primarily on identifying that Daniel is Daniel, for him to be able to do what he does, whether he's working from home or a coffee shop or the office. It's much less about the network that he's connected to. But there are other areas of IT that we need to be considering that balance. So for those who, say work in the power or energy industry or other industry where there's a lot more operational technology, that's often reversed because you're dealing with technology that's very old and needs to be constrained by the network. And then also lastly, that sort of data center or administrator control, there's a bit more of a balance between both of them, not just who an administrator is, but also whether or not they've been secured onto the network. So I just thought that was an interesting slide for those who are having zero trust conversations with a variety of customers or even internally. So in terms of Microsoft and identity, I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm just going to talk about a few today, but there is a heap of Microsoft Cloud focus on identity. In their strategy and government space, they've got the governance space. There's access reviews and entitlement management, reporting analytics. With Lifecycle, there's a really exciting stuff happening with SCIM and automatic provisioning. There's heaps going on in authentication and MFA. And one that we will cover today, or actually all that we will cover today will be within the lower two, the authentication side of things and the privileged access management in terms of governing privileged users. So any questions before I jump into cloud authentication and the various ways that we can set that up? Cool, I'll move right on. So cloud authentication. So firstly, a call out. In terms of assumptions, I'm talking here specifically around a hybrid organization where you've got an Active Directory and then you're considering how to do identity in a hybrid identity between that and the cloud, specifically with Azure. So I'm not, if you've got an organization that is completely greenfields and you don't need to stand up on-premise Active Directory, then you don't need to consider all of this because you can just do cloud-only accounts. Excuse me, and completely bypass that sort of extra layer of complexity that these decisions bring. So options for cloud authentication. You can sync up the password from on-premise so that the user, and by the way, there actually is a sort of a fourth option here. You can just have completely separate identities. But of course, the user experience of having a Daniel in the cloud and a Daniel on-premise with a different password is horrible. So very, very few organizations go for that. But some organizations do that, especially when they're initially rolling out cloud and they're just going to be doing proof of concepts and things like that. Having a cloud that's isolated is completely fine and an option. So password sync, where you're, so in all of these cases, we'll be installing Azure Active AAD Connect, sorry, to synchronize the users up into the cloud. So the identity is sitting there, but these decisions are around how we do the authentication piece of that, the cloud identity and the on-prem. So one is you can send up the password. It gets hashed and sent up to the cloud. Another one is you can do pass-through authentication. and I'll be going through each of these in details in a moment, where when an authentication attempt comes to Azure Active Directory and it says, Michael, you're claiming to be you, it hands off that authentication verification to on-premise. It passes through the authentication. Or you can also do a federated authentication. So if you've got another identity provider in the mix, some organizations need to keep ADFS around to do their authentication. That's quite rare. Usually now you can transition to one of the first two, hopefully password sync, and I'll go through why in a moment. But you might have a pre-existing identity provider, say Ping or Okta or Auth0. There are all kinds of authentication providers that you might want to federate with, and you can do that from Azure and offload the authentication to that other provider. So first one is the simplest and the one that I generally would recommend to customers first off, and that is a password hash sync. So as I mentioned earlier, we're talking about the AAD Connect application, taking the passwords from on-prem, hashing them and pushing them up to the cloud, and the cloud enabling the cloud to do the authentication itself. And there are numerous benefits. Obviously, in all of these cases, we're looking at users having the same username and password that they use on premise, and you don't have to deploy any additional infrastructure. You just pop on AAD Connect, tick the necessary tick boxes, the users get synced up, the passwords get synced up, and the users can auth. And all of that auth, because it's happening within Azure Active Directory, has all of the security features that are native to it. The second option was the pass-through authentication. So this one is a little bit more complex. There's a bit more setup to do. So you've still got Azure AD Connect. They're doing the identity sync, so it's pushing up all of the user attributes and all of the users, but it doesn't push up the password, or you can tell it not to. And so when a user comes to authenticate with Azure Active Directory, instead of doing that authentication attempt within Azure AD, it pushes that down to agents that have been installed on Active Directory, and those actually do the auth with AD. So the advantage of this is there are some companies that are really picky about where the passwords are located, and so it enables you to still keep all of that on premise. Also, when you, if I jump back a slide, when you have Azure AD doing the authentication for you, because it's not touching Active Directory, you're missing out on, if you've gone quite customized on all of your policies, you'll miss out on things like login hours and all of those extra things that AD can be configured to check for. User account states, maybe password policies when resetting passwords and things like that. So this, if those are really important to the organization, this is sort of a good middle ground between fully offloading the authentication via federation and having Azure AD do it using password sync. The final method of doing authentication is to federate with an identity provider. And this diagram is designed around it working using ADFS, but it can be done with any other IDP. So again, you've still got Azure AD Connect pushing up the user identities to Azure AD. You've still got the user going initially to Azure AD to start that sign-in process, but the user sign-in gets redirected to ADFS or Ping or whichever IDP has been configured. And this is the configuration that allows the most bespoke setup, but it's also the most complicated one to do, because you've got to have that whole other IDP, you've got to configure Azure AD to do the redirect, you've got to make sure that's linked back in with Active Directory so that the whole flow is going to work well. So I've pulled off a decision tree that Microsoft sort of advises that users go through, and I'm going to go through that, but then I'm also going to take a step back and talk about ADFS in general and why I think that can be easily deprecated. So the decision tree. Do you want Azure Active Directory to handle your sign-ins completely in the cloud? And by the way, there are other advantages to doing that. There was an organization a few years ago, I can't actually remember the name, they were a very high-profile company, and they had a ransomware attack that took down all of their on-premises servers. But because they had used the first scenario, if we go back to slide 8, where they'd synced up not only the user's identity, but also the passwords, they could just cut that link back to on-premise, and their users could still keep on using all of the cloud applications, all of Office 365 and all the other SaaS applications that had been linked in. Whereas if they had been running a setup where they hadn't been syncing the password up, say they'd chosen not to with Pass-Through Authentication, or they'd chosen not to by using another IDP, they wouldn't have had that option, because they'd have to literally go through and reset all of those users' passwords to give them passwords to use in the cloud. So that's one thing to consider. It's not just about where do we want our passwords to sit, or how much do we care about using all of the extra configuration that we can do in AD, but it's also the advantages to having that extra copy of credentials in the cloud and being able to just say, hey, Microsoft, you take care of auths and we'll fix up this other stuff. So let's just say that you said no, you'd made the decision that no, you didn't want to do that. So then do you want to integrate with an existing Federation provider? As I said, there's lots of reasons, a lot of big organizations. I'm working on a tender at the moment and they have ping. So we'll likely be proposing that we integrate with ping to keep the same sign-on experience for all of their users. So if you say yes to that, then we're coming all the way down onto the right bottom. Do you want sign-in disaster recovery or leaked credentials reports? So this is something that I sort of didn't cover off in those earlier 2 slides. When you're using AAD Connect and you can choose to push those passwords up into the cloud, whether or not you use them is separate from this. So you can still push up your passwords, say, for example, here in Pass-Through Authentication, but have the password sitting in the cloud. And the nice thing about doing that is when you push your passwords up into the cloud, Microsoft will go and do things like check whether those credentials has previously been breached. So you can still use another identity provider and use so Federation in the far right, but have password hash sync so the passwords are still being passed up so that Microsoft can inform you when a user's credential gets hacked. I just noticed there was a question that's come through from Mike. Can you give me an example of an AD security policy? Yeah, absolutely. So that was in regards to why you might want to use Pass-Through Authentication. So one example in terms of resetting passwords might be you might have a really complex password requirement. You know, you require things to be so long or have so many special characters in them, and resetting passwords in Azure AD doesn't give you that same level of complexity. A really popular example is user account states. So when a user expires in on-premise Active Directory, if you're using just the password hash sync. Azure AD, unless you set up a few extra things, doesn't know that that user is expired, and it will still allow them in to Azure AD to access Office 365. A third common example would be, I think they're called sign-in hours. So you'd say, hey, this, I'll use me as example, I'm allowed to work between these hours, but for on weekends, I'm just not allowed to sign in because no one else might be there and there might be security risks. But when we run with just password hash sync, it doesn't know about those extra rules. You have to do pass-through authentication for the authentication to know about that password policy and be rejected. So I hope that answers your question, Mike. If not, feel free to pop another question in chat. So back to this decision tree. So we've talked about the bottom right result where you're federating, but you're still pushing passwords up to get the leaked credential report. Or if you say, no, we're not going to worry about the leaked credential report, then you can just go with federation. If we go right back to the start, into that first triangle where we're talking about, we say, yes, we do want Azure AD to handle our authentication. Then we come down to that question that Mike Allen, you were asking further about, do we want to enforce those extra policies in AD? Yes. Then we say, do we, basically, are we going to need to federate? Do we have a sign-in requirement that's not natively supported by Azure AD? And if not, we again come to that question around the leaked credentials report. So coming back to slide 9, we can set this up with pass-through authentication, and we can choose to still send the passwords up, even though we're not going to be using them to auth to get that leaked credentials report, or we could choose not to. Just a little bit more on the leaked credentials report. Microsoft security, basically, they get both from state governments, and also they have their own people on the dark web that look for password breaches. And when they find that a password is on those lists, they will turn that into a hash and then compare where that hash exists and give us a leaked credentials report if any of our users are using those passwords. So that's what the password hash sync is so helpful for, even if you're not going to have the users authenticating on Azure Active Directory. So, and then we've pretty much already gone through all the boxes on the tree, but if we continue down on that left one to the bottom left triangle, do you have a sign-in requirement that's not natively supported? No, we don't. We're not going to do federation. Great. We can just do password hash sync and Seamless SSO. Now, when all of this first came out years ago, it was very common that organizations were using ADFS and had very custom requirements that couldn't be taken care of using Azure Active Directory. In most cases, that is no longer the case. And most clients, after I talk through with why they really think they need Azure Active, they need ADFS, they actually don't. For using pass-through authentication, one of the big reasons this was originally developed was not actually because of using sign-in hours and user states. Those are, in my experience, rarely used, but because initially there was a huge reaction to people not wanting to send passwords up to live on the cloud. And so Microsoft built this to allow those very security conscious organizations to not have to sync passwords up into the cloud. But in almost all cases now, with most customers, unless they're a huge customer that already has a lot of investment into identity, and so they've got their own third-party identity provider, I would be strongly advising them to do password hash sync and have Azure Active Directory doing the authentication. And a bit later on, I'll get into some of the benefits of that. although I am conscious of time. I realize I've burned through 20 minutes already. So one little last piece on this aspect. When you install Azure AD Connect, there's an extra option in there called Seamless Single Sign-On. And I sometimes get questions from customers about what this is. And basically, all of these three architectures, the password hash sync, the on-prem auth, the pass-through auth, or the third-party federation, all of them allow you to authenticate and then be able to log into Office 365 or whatever applications you've got synced with Azure AD. But without seamless single sign-on, the user is going to have to do that auth again. With seamless single sign-on, what it does is it does an extra link with the on-premise AD, so that the Kerberos token that they've already got from authenticating when they started work that day and entered their password or did Windows Hello or use their fingerprint to auth, can be passed through, so that when they go to access Office 365 or Salesforce, if you've integrated that in, whatever it is, they just flow straight in. And it makes the user experience so much better, because they just sign in once and they seamlessly are signed into what they'll see as Office 365 usually. They're not going to have to enter their password yet again. And it's great because if you're doing either the password hash sync, or if you're doing pass-through authentication, it's just an extra checkbox that you tick within Azure AD Connect to be able to have the seamless sign-on integrating and working. So it's a bit more complicated if you're using a third-party IDP. So that's a bit more bespoke case, but in those first two cases, just an extra tick box that'll get users straight in there. So that was sort of it's not high level, but it's not low level, a mid level introduction to doing a cloud authentication. Yes, fire away, questions. Was that a question I heard? Maybe not. Sorry, maybe someone just came off mute for a moment. So yeah, feel free to pop any questions into chat, and I'll happy to jump back to slides on this. Otherwise, I will jump into governance. Actually, I'll jump back in the slides. Well, I will try to. Here we go. So far I've covered off why identity is so important when we're considering considering anything, but particularly within the context of Azure and considering how we're going to do that architecture, why it's really important. I've talked through the potential architectures for cloud authentication within a hybrid environment. And next, I want to talk a little bit about governance, and specifically around governance for administrator access. So another area that I often get into conversations with clients about is privileged access management. So earlier when I was talking about identity and the how important it has become from a security aspect, it's even more so with privileged access management. And when I say privileged access, I basically mean anyone that you would consider some kind of super user or administrator or a user with special privileges, maybe even just as little as being able to reset other users' passwords, like a user administrator. They basically have the power to be able to make all kinds of changes. And if I jump back to that example of Service New South Wales last year, it was bad enough that the attackers were able to get into non-privileged accounts and access all the information that was in the emails and extract that. But if they had been able to gain access to an administrator account, the damage that they would be able to do would be even greater. There was an example of, I think it was Victorian Department of Health Services, where they had, I think it was a contractor who had admin privileges, and that access remained after the contract was finished, and the contractor decided to log in and extract information. And because they're an administrator, they could access a huge amount of stuff. So it's being able to appropriately audit and govern administrator access is really important. Yeah, their credentials are targeted, and also I've added there, accidents happen. I was doing a video a few weeks ago and talking about how one time I was making a change and I thought I was in a non-prod environment, and I made the change and went home for the day, and then realized as I got calls on my way home from the warehouse guys that I'd actually made the change in production. And a part of thinking about how we manage the administrative access is not just for, malicious actions, but also just unintentional. If there had been something where I'd had to go through an an authorization process to gain the administrative access in prod, I would have realized very quickly that I was trying to do it in prod and not in dev. So within the context of Azure, there's plenty of enterprise organizations that have enterprise implementations of privileged access management. Maybe they've got, say, CyberArk or Thycotic or Safeguard from One Identity. There's lots of options out there, but for many organizations that are is sort of on that cloud journey, they either aren't managing their privileged access management, or they haven't really thought about how to do it in the cloud. And for both those scenarios, that's what privileged identity management from Microsoft is all about. It's about being able to do privileged identity management in the cloud. So, what are the things that it can do? Well, it can provide just-in-time privileged access management to Azure AD and Azure resources. So, for example, I set this up at one client. So when a global administrator goes into the portal, instead of just being able to look and reset a user's password straight off or delete a user straight off, they have to request global administrator privileges. And they'll have to put in a time frame to address the second point. Say, I'm only going to use this for 1 hour, and then it's going to stop. Or I'm only going to use this for 8 hours. Actually, no, that isn't the second point. The second point is to do with start and end dates, which is a good segue back to the Victoria Department of Health, where they had that contractor who just had the access and it just continued on. One of the things that PIM allows you to do is say, hey, I want you to give, let's say you have me working in your organization, I want to give Michael global administrator privileges, but I only want him to have them for the next 3 months, or I only want him to be eligible for the next 3 months. It allows you to be able to have approval for those privileged roles. So let's say when I come to do something, not only do I have to go and do extra steps to get that access, but one of those steps can be actually getting basically permission and authorization from someone else to be able to take that step. And that links in with some of the other ones, like if we jump down to the justification. So I might say, I'm logging on, I need global administrative privileges because I'm going to have to cull a whole bunch of user accounts or something like that. And then, whoever's overseeing that can say, yep, Michael's allowed to have a couple of hours of global administrator access to be able to do that. But as soon as I finish that time, my access goes away. You can also, if you don't already request MFA everywhere, you can also say, hey, for any privileged role, I want to make sure that the person does MFA, and PIM allows you to do that. You can also get notifications. So you can say, hey, you can request it without needing the approval workflows, but we're going to get a notification every time you do it. So if you log on at 1 a.m. After your contract is finished or whatever, we're going to know about it and be able to take action. It also has an entire access review component, and also for those that are more in the compliance area, you can also download audit history for either internal or external auditors as well. So that's what privileged identity management is, sort of some of the things that it will do. And this is all within Azure. Another thing to add actually for the first item, the just-in-time privileged access, that's not just to Azure Active Directory. So, I could have, just-in-time access to be able to do that stuff in Azure Active Directory. But it could also have just-in-time access to be able to edit virtual machines or start and stop them, or also all of the other sort of roles that you have within Azure to be able to do things. This can, privileged identity management can be applied to. It's just really powerful for monitoring and securing these aspects. Another thing that I see organizations do a lot is they will say, in terms of privileged access management, say, Michael, I want you to have an administrator account and I want you to have just a regular user account. And one of the great things about using PIM or a full-on privileged access management system is, instead of having to have two different user accounts, one that I'm really cautious when I use it and try to log into very infrequently, and one just for me, it's always the same me. It's the same identity, Michael, that's tracked everywhere. Just I'm able to elevate my permissions when I need them and have them drop back down when I don't. So it's just such a powerful tool. This is a screenshot of the interface. You can look at the roles that you're eligible, the requests that you've sent out, if you're an approver, the things that you need to approve, and just manage the roles, look at the audit history, and so on. It's pretty obvious, but I just also wanted to highlight the three main roles that you have within PIM, because it can do a lot, but when it comes down to it, it's a fairly simple system in terms of the three types of people that are interacting with it. Basically, you've got the person setting it up. So they're saying, Michael, you're eligible for these roles for this time period. Daniel, you're going to be the approver, and so on and so forth. You've got the people like Daniel who'll be the ones with approval to allow people in. And one of the cool things about this is they don't have to be IT people either. You can say, if it's a smaller company, you could have the MD being the one that approves for GA access when that's needed, or something like that. Or if you were going to subdivide things down, you could have someone who owns a business function or a business group doing the approval process for an administrator coming in to make changes to that. And then, of course, you have the people that are eligible for the roles, the actual administrators that are going to be doing the work. So yeah, that is sort of the summary of the different roles within privileged identity management. Any questions on what PIM is, what it does, and I guess in general how to use it before I move on? Just check chat. No, it doesn't look like anything. Daniel and Damien, I did also want to cover a little bit of risky sign-in and user risk under identity protection, but we are at the top of the hour. Are you happy for me to continue, or did you want me to hold off here? So this is a good stopping point if you want to stop on the hour.
No,
absolutely welcome to continue.
Okay, cool. All right, I'll make it quick.
So we can go a little longer. So don't feel pressured.
Okay,
It's
cool.
it's awesome feedback, content.
There's
Sorry,
no,
Dan.
there's no hard cutoff time here. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I just remembered last session, Rory, I think, finished like dead on the hour. Okay, cool.
It's great content. Keep going. It's awesome.
Okay, cool, excellent. So identity protection, and actually, I'll jump back for a moment to highlight all of the different things that we've talked about so far. So, we talked about why identity is so important when you're thinking about digital transformation, or in this context, doing anything within Azure. Absolutely critical. I've talked a little bit about the types of architecture that you could use to do hybrid identity between Azure and Active Directory. We've just talked a bit about one of the many governance elements of Azure. I think it's one of the most important, doing privileged identity management. If that's, one of the first things that you do is get in and say, hey, I want to make sure that people can't just get in and change things, and they have to do MFA. It's just so helpful when you have a contractor to come in to not just be like, hey, you have GA, but you only have GA for the next 29 days or however long the project is. It's so helpful and very easy to use. One exception I would say in terms of privileged identity management is make sure that you exclude your emergency access accounts from it. So what you don't want is for, if something's gone drastically wrong, a conditional access policy has been set up incorrectly, suddenly users can't get in, and you need to be able to get in to change things. You don't want to have that user, the emergency access account, need to, say, get approval from someone who can no longer log in. So it's Microsoft's best practice to have 2 emergency accounts on within each Azure AD tenant, and those to be global administrators, with the passwords sort of stored away or stored with 2 separate people or whatever. And then you can just limit using conditional access where those users can sign in, say like only from our 2 offices, or whatever, to make sure that they're not going to be sort of, well, they can't be brute forced, but to make sure that they're not going to be hacked into from overseas. Although I retract that. If you had legacy authentication still allowed, they could potentially still be brute forced. But I digress. Okay, so we were now moving into identity protection, the last topic for today. And there is just so much to Azure Active Directory and the identity sides of it. I'm barely scratching the surface. But hopefully in these 3 different pieces today, and combined with what Rory talked about last session, you've got at least an overview of some of the different areas. So identity protection is about, protecting identities, making sure with an extra degree of security that I am the Michael that I claim to be. Excuse me. So it's a term that Microsoft uses to cover quite a broad spread of things. I'm only going to talk about a few specific things today, but just to cover off the bigger picture, automating the detection and remediation are identity-based risks, and I'll cover a little bit of that off today. Investigating those risks, like data will be fed into the portal, which can be used, and also exporting that risk, not exporting the risk, exporting the risk detection data to third-party utilities for additional analyzing. And one of the cool things about using Azure Active Directory as your point of authentication. So if I jump back way to the start, to slide 8, to have Azure AD as that point that's doing the authentication is we often tend to think of authentication just as our company. You know, if I think about MOQ, I'm like, well, you know, I'm on my own. I'm an island. I'm dealing with people just authenticating with me. How can I make that better? But you've got to realize when you take that step to doing authentication in the cloud, you're joining a piece of infrastructure that spans the globe. And so your authentications now are no longer a sort of a just to do with your organization, but Microsoft can see those authentications within a global perspective. So it would be impossible for me to be able to, you know, be always checking whose passwords had been compromised on the dark web. It would be impossible for me to have a, you know, quickly adapting list of all the IPs that were currently controlled by botnets or that were registered as having malware on them. But Microsoft can do that. And by using that architecture where Microsoft is taking care of the authentication, you get to do all this extra really cool stuff, a little bit of which I'm going to talk about today. So like one of the things that Microsoft likes to talk about a lot is they, you know, they deal with 6.5 trillion signals per day in terms of Azure AD and the authentication piece. I mean, that's just ginormous. The amount of information that they're dealing with and knowing and working out the patterns within that as to what is coming from legitimate sources and what is not. It's incredibly powerful. So the first item that I wanted to talk about in terms of identity protection was user risk. I talked a little bit about this earlier, forgetting that I had a whole slide on it later. But basically, you know, cyber criminals are in the business of getting compromised credentials and then publishing those on the dark web or selling them to other users to either discredit organizations or to allow other people to access them in. And because Microsoft can get a hold of these and then hash those and compare them with the hashes that they already have, they can provide us with lists that say, hey, Michael, your user Sam, his password has been compromised elsewhere. So it's not just like a list of banned passwords where you're like, well, I don't want people to use password1 or password exclamation or my company name MOQ Digital, but actually, hey, this password has been found somewhere else on the web, has been published. You know, you probably don't want to use that anymore. Also, in terms of user risk, that machine learning around all of the different types of authentication not just can be applied to that broad spread of authentications, but can also be applied to that individual user. So, you know, as IT admins, we can look at logs and we could manually go through and say, oh, that's odd. It's rare for Michael to be up at 1 a.m. Doing these things. Whereas in terms of user risk, Microsoft can use machine learning to know that and flag that risk and say, hey, this is a high risk user now. The way in which they're using their usage patterns are abnormal. So there's a second type of risk. So first of all, there's user risk. Is that user, the user themselves, a risk? Are we not sure that they are who they are? But then there's also sign-in risk. Is this actual attempt to authenticate just in that one instance, does it contain a high degree of risk? Does the attempt come from an anonymous IP? You know, are they using something like Tor? Is it unusual travel? You know, does the user not usually log in from here? You know, they usually are at that coffee shop and they're usually at home, they're usually at the office, but they've never been to this random town or whatever it is, right? Is this an IP address that has been known to have malware on it? Are there unusual properties? Are they maybe you know, using a different device than they usually use. Maybe they're, or they or who they claim to be is coming in from a cyber cafe that they haven't run into that device before. Also, the sign-in risk, the admin can actually just say, hey, this user has been compromised. Also, there's things like if that IP address has had authentication attempts from it before that have been denied, so potentially it's being used for a brute force, it's flagged by Microsoft and then can be used to elevate the sign-in risk. I won't walk through all of these, but there's a whole heap of different signals that Microsoft uses for each sign-in to determine the risk against that. A really common one actually is the impossible travel. That and the password spray are two of my ones where I'm like, goodness, if I was managing authentication, it would be incredibly difficult for me to do that. But Microsoft can do this at scale. Know instantly that it was impossible for a user to be here and now suddenly in Singapore logging in 5 minutes later. Or to look on the other way. It turns out that there's been authentication attempts from this one IP hitting different users every 5 minutes from a single IP, hitting different users within our organization, that sort of password spray method that used to just get around all of the brute force attempts because you were trying all of the different users. You weren't hitting the same user over and over again. But now Microsoft can see that happening and raise the sign-in risk for us. Here's a picture of the interface for this aspect of identity protection. So you can, it's showing you the risky users that have been detected in that upper graph, and in the lower graph, it's showing you the risky sign-ins detected. And so you can manually go in and say, hey, these 7 users it's saying are high-risk users. And you can jump into that, click on that, and look and see whether their passwords got leaked online, or whether suddenly their usage patterns have changed, or whatever it is, right? The last thing I want to talk about in terms of user risk and sign-in, which both of which are actually a small part of identity protection. That's part of a huge suite of tools. I wanted to talk a bit about remediation, because if, as an IT admin, the only way in which you interacted with this was looking at whether going through manually, oh, I have 7 high-risk users, I have 12 medium-risk users. Oh, I just noticed that for the past 7 days, Michael's sign-ins have been high risk. They've all been coming from a botnet. You can have automatic remediation. So within conditional access policies, you can say, hey, when user risk is high or medium, I will force that user to do a password reset. So the user would have to go through and re-verify themselves using MFA and give themselves a new password. So their password, maybe they had, because we all know that users, including myself, sometimes use the same password for work as they do. Actually, that's not true for me. I don't do it for work. I use it for other sites, but we'll use the same password for work and for other sites. But let's say that other site gets compromised, the credentials are leaked on the dark web, and that user tries to log in at work using that same password that's been leaked. You can say, using conditional access policies, hey, your password has been leaked. You're going to need to reset that password right now using MFA, or however you've configured self-service password reset. It's so powerful. The IT admin didn't have to intervene. Microsoft went and found the leaked credentials. It flagged the user risk as high. On next login, your policy said, hey, go update your password. Or in terms of sign-in risk, let's say there's that password spray attack happening, and a single IP is hitting, every 5 minutes is hitting a different user of your organization. And Microsoft, after the third user, is like, well, hold on a moment. I'm going to declare that all sign-in attempts from that IP are now suspect. I'm going to raise the sign-in risk to medium or to high. you can have a conditional access policy that says, hey, when I get sign-in attempts that are medium risk or high risk, I'm going to require that the user does MFA. And so then as that password spray attack continues, every time they attempt, they're just going to get prompted for MFA. And they're not going to be able to continue with that. Just an awesome automatic response to the attacker. MFA, both for resetting a password and to verify the user's identity, is just such a powerful way to make sure that users are who they say they are and to mitigate that risk. All right, I think that was all on that. So that was, I'll just go through a quick overview and then I'll probably finish up. Identity is super important. And even if identity isn't something that you do as a day job, I highly recommend that you consider it, or at least ask the questions around it when thinking about any project that you're doing. We're talking today within the context of Azure, but as an identity expert, I'd say almost any project. Even if it's going to be completely back-end, you still got to consider the administrative access, how that's going to be managed, and so on. We talked a whole bunch about identity integration and those 3 methods that you can have hybrid identity: pushing the passwords up, having the passwords come down to AD, or using a third-party provider to do the authentication for you. We talked a bunch about privileged identity management and specifically Microsoft's answer to that within Azure, PIM, and making sure that your admins are going to be able to be governed in a much better way, and that it's not going to cost them too much extra time to do that. And lastly, I touched on it, just a few little things around identity protection. Automatically detecting and remediating for user risk, that a user may be compromised or maybe about to be compromised, and sign-in risk, that an authentication attempt just isn't quite legitimate, and things we can do about that. So there we go. That's 3 little snippets of identity and Azure. Thanks for listening. Feel free to fire any questions away.
Wow, thanks, Michael. That's awesome. We do have a question. Some shady bloke asked a question in the chat about are these identity protection features only available in the premium tiers? You may have mentioned that. I might have missed it.
No, I did miss that. So in terms of the latter 2 things, so the identity protection, where we're talking about user risk and sign-in risk, and also in terms of PIM, those are P2 licensing features. So those require the highest tier. So those would also be included in like E5 or any of your sort of end tier licensing models. But in terms of the stuff that I talked about early on in the presentation, where we're talking about whether we're doing password hash syncs or pass-through auth or whatever, those are outside of the licensing constructs in terms of the architecture design principles. They don't require any particular licenses.
Great, thanks. I think Arnie has a question as well. Should each user have a premium AAD license for the whole tenant to be protected? What happens when there's not enough licenses on a tenant? Will the tenant be not fully protected?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the privileged identity management, you only need those P2 licenses for the admins that are interacting with the PIM interface, that are going to have their privileges elevated and come down. You don't need that across the entire organization. If you're doing, however, if you're doing the user risk and the sign-on risk, then those do need to have the P2 licenses for each user that you want those to apply to. And by the way, you don't have to use these features to get really good protection. So Arnie, for example, if all that you did with your Azure Active Directory was you had password hash sync, and you turned on and forced MFA for every single sign-in. That drastically increases your protection. Yeah, I could talk for hours on MFA, so I'm not going to get too started on it. But yeah, so don't think that you have to use these features to get a lot of the protection. You can use things like MFA to gain a huge amount of protection just straight off the bat without the licensing features.
Awesome. I think that's all the questions in the chat. I don't know if anybody else wants to ask something. Feel free to come off mute if you want. Okay, doesn't look like they are. So, well, that was fantastic, Michael. That was really good. I learned a bit through that. You just presented everything, some concepts which I've heard about before, but you presented them so clearly. It was really very, very effective. So thanks for that. It's an awesome presentation. And you know, we always appreciate all our speakers that we have at these groups. And you know, just because this is a virtual event doesn't mean that we can't, you know, celebrate by passing you a nice bottle. So, you know, thanks very much for your time there and and doing that. Awesome. I think you're on mute, by the way.
Sorry, I just said thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Hey guys.
Hi.
Hello? Oh, Dan, Can you hear me?
Yep,
Hi,
we can.
Hey, mate. Hey, Michael, quick question. What's your take on this? And sorry, firstly, my apologies. I missed the first 40 minutes. I just had to go for my jab. What's your take on identity is a new perimeter? We hear that quite a bit. It's I don't know if to call it the buzzword, but you know, you go everywhere. It's like identity is a new perimeter. Is that truly a perimeter? Like, because in most ways, like, you know, it's identity is still a compromised thing. What's your view on that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so we did talk a little bit about that. Ed, by the way, congratulations on your jab.
Thanks,
I hope it's not been too painful. Some of the other people at work have been getting them lately, and it's been cool to see things moving forward in that area. But yeah, we did talk a little bit about that earlier. I linked in the idea of identity as a new perimeter into that zero trust conversation, and the idea that we used to my pleasure, Arnie, glad you enjoyed it. We used to think about just the network as being compromised, and we didn't really care too much about authentication within that. Once someone had compromised the network, it was relatively easy to move within that. But now, not just because there's a couple of things that have moved outside the network, right? Users have moved outside the network. They're doing a lot more from home. And I mean, COVID just really drastically expanded that, but it's already happening. But also applications have moved out of the corporate environment. So now so many applications are not within the corporate network. And we're also wanting a lot more flexibility with that access. So, excuse me. Should find my water. One sec. So yeah, I think it's a really important mindset change. You know, I was talking with a customer the other day, and they were saying, yeah, we use VPNs for our users. You know, that's secure, right? And I was like, yes, VPNs are secure, but I want you to imagine for a moment that that an attacker has got the credentials and is able to get into your VPN. You know, they're suddenly on your entire network. Now, let's say instead of trying to secure your VPN, that one application that user needed to access, you publish that through Azure Active Directory, say using app proxy, or you modernize the app or something like that. Then not only are you reducing your attack surface because there's just a single app for that user to touch base, you're also putting in front of that app what I talked about in the second part, like that massive, Microsoft's massive machine learning ability to defend against attacks, and you're putting like state-of-the-art MFA and everything else in front of it. And that's an example of that shift between like, we secure network access and we're going to think about authenticating the user themselves. And also in doing so, there's often a change in mindset from we're going to give a user access to the network and we're going to give the user access to an application as well. I don't know whether that answers your question. Happy to rephrase or whatever.
No,
Actually, I'll show you one other slide that I showed earlier, Kishore. I also went through this slide because sometimes depending on where people work, there is a different need for the type of security. So in terms of user access and productivity, your users are really mobile. They're going to often want to use SaaS applications. So we're focused more on identity as our main type of security. That's where we're going to put all of our effort. Completely opposite if we're talking about OT. If we're talking about running a power plant or automating a warehouse or something like that, then we're dealing more on the technology side, often with older tech that is much harder to secure using identity, and therefore will need to wall off networks and do a lot more of that network-based security. And then sort of if you look to sort of infrastructure security, data center security, it's a mix between the two. So hopefully that helps as well. It's not always just about.
Yeah, no, this is a really good slide. Thanks for that.
Yeah, that's all right. I stole it from Microsoft.
Right. Great. Just a bit of housekeeping. The recording will be published. Give it a few days, probably over the weekend. I'll do it, and just look for the link to be posted on the Meetup site. So we'll have it there. And also next month, normally our meetup would be on the second Wednesday, which is the 14th of July. But there's some silly other event that's going on that day, State of Origin, something like that, whatever that is. I tried to contact them and get them to move it, but they were quite rude to me. So unfortunately, we've had to move our event instead, even though ours is much more important. So I'm thinking it's probably going to be the Wednesday before, which is the 7th of July. Just check the Meetup site. I'm just confirming with the speaker for that. But we got Wayne Hoggett who's going to come in and talk about Azure Virtual Desktop. So yeah, it should be a good one. Great. So thank you so much again, Michael. That was awesome. I'm going to stop the recording now, and we'll just keep an eye on the Meetup site for the recording link. And Michael, I don't know if you want to share your slides, but if you're welcome to and want to give me a link of where you have them posted, we could do that if you want to do that. We definitely will share the slides that Damien showed earlier, and that link will also be on the Meetup site.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's a fantastic job